Do you think that this interest in the theater overlaps somewhat in your interest in archetypes in mythology, since that's in many ways typically a theatrical experience? I mean, that's typically a theatrical thrust. Those archetypes are often
poetry is myth, and I think we keep forgetting that because Western Apollonian tradition so narrowed poetry down to the lyric that we forget what its really big source is, which is the mythic, and not just that little skim of feelings off the top of it. One of my favorite poets and a powerful influence on me is Robinson Jeffers, because he was a California poet, and actually I studied Jeffers in high school, but my first encounter with Jeffers was his translation of Medea, which is why that's such an important thing. In my sophomore English class, listening to Judith Anderson records, her reciting the Medea, and then I fell in love with those long narrative poems that he wrote, which he called his stories. He called them his stories. But he's really the only modern poet, modern American poet, who provided that model for us. And since he's been siphoned off as not part of the mainstream, even though he was on the cover of Time magazine in 1932, but it was for his version of Medea, not for his poetry. No, that's a model there for me, and I see that as something that still hasn't really entered with the kind of power that it can enter in the mainstream American poetry, but it's there. We have a tradition for it, and we have poets like myself who've been pulling at it and pulling pieces and chunks off of it and trying to use them in whatever limited ways we've been able to. I think there's going to be a whole new generation of poets.
So you see it coming around in the same way that, say, Whitman came around down the line?
Well, it'll be poetry in the Whitman tradition very much.
Well, that's sort of like the narrative tradition, too, that everybody's suddenly re-interested in, almost. Like the stories.
Yes, but it's not going to be in rhyming couplets, I assure you. That is the one thing it's not going to be. But, of course, you know, there was that novel, The Golden Gate, 2 years ago, published in rhyming couplets. And
that's true. But it's almost like the longer poem, there's like this interest in not just length, in terms of length, but in terms of epic, of creating a myth that we can go with, that we can sort of learn from, almost like the Iliad.
Do you think that's because basically America doesn't have that single big long epic poem? Really? I mean,
well, we're ready to write our epic. We may be also in that interesting period of history that I don't know any parallel to, where we're just beginning to have our history and be ready to write it, but also at the end of our history. We may be at the fall of our civilization while we just discovered its peak, in which case we're going to have to write our epic very fast, I'd say within the next 50 years.
The MTV epic, huh?
Yes, or we're going to be a lesson for somebody else.
But that's traditionally a time when great drama can be produced also.
That's what, we have to have a breakdown.
Well, you have to have a powerful history with a common set of myths to work with, and you also have to see it in some kind of finite way, which is usually when it's at the end. You can begin to see it finite.
Oh, that's where we went wrong.
So that's when, you know,
Are you talking? I hear you talking one way about myth making. I mean, it seems to be right now it's myth making. But earlier you mentioned relying upon archetypes that already seem to be in place. Is there
I don't think I was talking about myth making. I'm talking about using myth. I think poetry uses myth. I think that poets create their own personal mythology, but it only is a myth if it's based on archetypes, and then becomes a personal version of it.
Or are you talking about creating a myth, using a myth, and recreating it in like present time? You know, like Elvis's you mean like that? That kind of thing?
Things. I mean, you know, we are an American civilization who evidently lacks a certain amount of myths upon which other civilizations might rely, as we rely on myths that.
A bit, yeah.
And we're not talking about. I'm not talking about overt myth. I'm talking about you know, archetypes that we perhaps aren't even aware of. For example, in the Emeralds poem you read earlier, the aging boy riding the bike. I mean, that's an unusual archetype, but everybody knows who he is. You know, at least, I mean, I've seen that guy.
Oh, in the neighborhood.
You know,
I mean,
yeah,
that kind of thing.
you know.
Oh, archetypes like that. Like maybe urban archetypes are what we don't realize we have already. I mean, like that? Or were you using it that way?
Well, I think isn't
I think
that
I
an
see where you're
interesting
going, but
kind of idea, though, that each culture has particular cultural icons which we recognize because they have that archetype behind them. The older man riding a bicycle certainly would not be an archetype of the 15th century, say. But
Well, there weren't
if
any
you're
bicycles,
urban
were there? No.
in America,
Well,
that
maybe
means
we're
something.
not using the word archetype really very accurately here. I mean, archetypal figures are wanderers, magicians, martyrs, warriors, mothers, fathers, etc.
Or the man on
What
the bicycle,
archetype does this aging boy on his bicycle represent? That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
He's certainly the wanderer, searching for something. He's maybe part of quest mythology, but he doesn't have a grail in mind, or maybe he doesn't believe it's possible for him to find the grail, if that's one of the possible things the quester searches for.
What would be a better term than archetype?
Well, I think the archetype in that poem is the woman, and she's the archetypal woman who believes her identity comes through something called femininity, which is represented in our culture by feminine beauty, one of the symbols of which is jewels. And your sexual part is referred to, you know, your jewels, male or female. And the man in the poem is not so much an archetypal man as a foil for, or representative of the culture that she's in, where she is confronted with the irony of the fact that all of the symbolic reality of that archetype is either a fraud or meaningless. And yet she's still tied to the myth that that's what must be accomplished in order for her to have fulfillment or wholeness. And she finds a way to receive the male homage. She gets these, they are genuine emeralds and genuine sapphires, even though they look like erasers, pencil erasers, and pieces of gravel, and they come through the male, which is her most satisfying form of.
I'd like to thank both Diane Wakoski and Josie Kearns for sending us a few jewels. This
Interesting.
has been
Choice of words.
Couplets, Michigan Poets on Poetry, live from Buckham Alley Theater. Thank you both very much.